gives me great pleasure to introduce our final panel for today. And I would just like to mention, I mean, we say it in the brochure, but the In or Out panel is sponsored by the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths. And that's an important connection because, of course, the Women's Art Library started as an artist-initiated slide library for women artists, set up by women artists who were very concerned about the terms in which they were or were not included in the art world. And it's a great resource for sort of belated discoveries of artists who we may not yet know about yet, but I'm sure, have sort of future potential. Anyway, the panel will be chaired by Gabby Moser, and I'm delighted that Gabby was able to come here from Toronto to join us, thanks to the still generous Canada Council for the Arts. Gabby's a colleague that I've worked with a lot before, and she's curating an exhibition in Canada around the strike as a sort of feminist and artistic tactic. So particularly appropriate that Gabby was here. And we're going to go straight in to Feminist Chorus after this. So we won't take the advertised break. We'll just go straight into our final rousing collective chorus. Thank you.
I'm just going to speak very briefly about some of the interests that I have in the topic of the panel and some of the prompts that I gave to the panelists to sort of think about before they begin their presentations. So, as Helena mentioned, my interest in the session this evening comes out of some curatorial research I'm doing right now, centered on the question of how withdrawal or exiting function as strategies of political refusal in a moment in which arts institutions seem impossibly expansive and immaterial. So I've been thinking about what it means to visualize withdrawal when maybe the most sort of radical gesture of withdrawal would be to stop making art and to stop representing one's practice. And so what it means to sort of make art about withdrawal or refusal and the tension between what can and cannot be visualized in that practice. So I've been thinking about a shift I can sort of imagine happening from something like Lee Lozano's now quite famous process of removing herself from participation in the art world in General Strike piece from 1969, and then from any contact with women, effectively abandoning her art career. And I think it's important that this is the same year that Autoritratti comes out for the first time, 1969, that there's a historical conjunction there. And I think this gesture by Lozano to leave the art world or to withdraw from the institutions of cultural production and reproduction suggests that you can define and delimit what those spaces look like in order to step outside of or to exit them. And I think that is a project that seems increasingly difficult in the conditions of fragmentation, exhaustion, and anxiety that we experience under networked capitalism, to draw on the language of Now You Can Go's framework. So I'm thinking kind of about some of Zach's earlier comments about what this means in a space where work is increasingly fragmented and immaterial and not tangible in terms of a place or a product. So in this context, strategies of refusal seem to be sort of much more imbricated in the present moment in the systems they aim to critique, perhaps accepting the idea that there's no outside to these institutions. So I've been thinking about work like Natasha Satter-Hagigian's proclamation, "I can't work like this," spelled out in hundreds of nails hammered into the gallery wall. And this work was created in response to her gallery's request that she represent them in a solo exhibition at a commercial art fair. So this is the work that she made. It ironically entered the Guggenheim's permanent collection last year. So we can think about those tensions as well. Or this, I think, sort of little-known work by Cecile Floyer, No Positions Available, in which she blocked up the windows of the Caddist Art Foundation with these signs, sort of declaring that there are no positions available anymore from which to enact a sort of critical strategy or of exit. And close to my heart and my home, Alison Mitchell and Deirdre Logue's crocheted protest banners that announce "We can't compete, we won't compete, we can't keep up, and we won't keep down," from 2012, that they present in museums and galleries alongside solo exhibitions of male artists. So this was an installation view at the Art Gallery of Ontario during the Jean-Michel Basquiat show. And this is here in the Tate Modern during Damien Hirst's retrospective. So this idea, I think, in all of these works where artists are questioning and rejecting the very narrow positions that are made available in contemporary artistic practice, and refuse the imperative of constant work and constant competition, which I think are both themes we've seen in Carla Lonzi's work and the work of the Milan Women's Bookstore Collective. So with these sort of strategies and examples in mind, the two questions I've posed to the panelists are, what does it mean to refuse to participate in an art system when that system pervades every aspect of our lives as artists, curators, archivists, and researchers? And secondly, what does it look like to stop participating in these systems when everything we do seems to now count as productive forms of work? So the panelists will each speak for 10 minutes, or present for 10 minutes about their work or practice. I think some of them will probably interrogate the very terms of these questions, I hope so. So I'm going to introduce them all now and then turn it over to each of them. So Karen Defranco is an archivist and curator. She's working with curator Elisa Kay on an exhibition for Chelsea Space in 2016 that explores strategies of withdrawal and retreat, as well as shelter within artistic practice. She's PhD candidate with Tate Britain and Reading University, researching forms, strategies, and contexts within artist publishing. With Amy Clark, she co-organizes the New Materialisms reading group at Banner Repeater, London, and is involved in the research project Disembodied Voice. Karolin Meunier is an artist and writer living in Berlin. She teaches at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. Her videos, texts, and performances examine how access to individual experience is accomplished through cultural techniques such as interviews or confessional speech. She's a member of Cinenova, feminist film and video distributor here in London, and edited the German translation of Torpor by Chris Kraus with B Books in 2015. Raju Rage is an interdisciplinary artist and writer who is proactive about carving space, self-representation, and self-empowerment using art and activism to forge creative survival. They are interested in the role of art in social change, transformative healing justice, and in collectively creating opportunities where there is a lack for QTIPOC artists who are often multi-marginalized for being queer and or trans and people of color. And lastly, Frances Rifkin is artistic director of Utopia Arts. She studied with Augusto Boal and is a Theater of the Oppressed practitioner. Frances also directs Implicated Theater, a company initiated by Jana Graham and Amal Khalaf for the Serpentine Gallery in 2011, most of whose members had to leave their home countries to live in the UK. She works with diverse communities, including professional performers, mental health service users, older people, and NHS staff.
Hello. Thanks for the invitation. I was mainly happy also to join this whole day and all the discussions. And I will say why I will do a reading of something, of a text, and it is in this book, and so I only wanted to briefly show. It's a project by Anthony Iles and now turned into this book called Anguish Language, Writing in Crisis, and edited also by Marina Wishmit, who we didn't see but heard today. And I will briefly say why I wanted to... Can someone put this thing in front of the projector? Thanks. I think I'm often interested in the materiality of the situation, and also this situation here. And I think I'm interested in the question of dropping out a specific language and a very specific pattern of speaking, and so also what does it mean to be in this space and to have this discursive way of speaking or using a specific theoretical language, and how can we avoid it or play with it, or is this even possible? And I think it's interesting also to think of this Italian feminism, or what I'm interested in is that they invented so many methods and strategies and practices to change their way of speaking or relating to each other. And especially what I know about Carla Lonzi, I mean, it's difficult to really know what she was doing when you can't read it. but I understood that she was working so much with conversations, and she really developed a practice, and this is also a way of dropping in somehow, going into conversations, and also to, really dropping into or going into a certain practice. And I don't want to turn her into an artist, of course, because she was very hostile to artists, we learned today. But I think one can also learn something from the way she worked, or the moment of staging conversations, recording conversations, and editing them, and making a new work out of that. And I find that really interesting. And I want to read from a conversation I had with Martin. He's an artist and musician, and we were commissioned or invited to do a workshop on English language. And we didn't know each other that well, and we wanted to prepare a workshop, and I recorded all our conversations, and then we edited it, and it's in the book. It's about 25 pages, and it's one big block, so that you can't see who said what. And I'm reading 10 minutes from it, so not 25 pages. I've been thinking about some common interests, like the construction of the self through language and the means of communication. Maybe we have to circle more around some of the issues in order to come closer to a set of questions that we can then transform into a performative moment. But would this be something we would do all together, or as a presentation and then a conversation around it? We have this special task to do something performative. There will be a kind of preparation in the sense that we are now talking about these issues, but we won't give the results of our thoughts, although we might already know what we want. We look at some questions and we want people to enact them. And we have a card up our sleeves. We might have a trick. We will inevitably have more awareness of where we want to go than the others. Or maybe, slowly, by what we are doing, we can make sense together about what's going on. We can use ourselves as a kind of material that they could look at. Yes, we should look precisely at who is involved in this situation, who has which role, the division of labor somehow, because it is not a simple performer-audience situation, but it is also not equal. The question I'd really like to follow is how the self is constructed or determined, especially if there's already this kind of tension of who we are, the roles, the expectations. Yes, and what one can do with certain patterns, or how to subvert them, or how to overfill something. I found it appealing to have to confront these issues, but not in a coziness, rather to embody them. There is a tension, you feel the crisis in itself. The realization becomes an experience that might be a frustration, a feeling of impotence, because it is not just coming from a discursively resolved position. Yes, and where's the crisis in our conversations, the moment we talk to each other, the language we use, in the way we speak about crisis? How do you think we should go forward? I'm a bit tired of improvising. I need something more rigid, like a gear or a rule, something which could help us in concrete ways to find out where we want to go and to find a strategy to go there. I would rather be minimally ambitious than be abstract all over the place. I agree, we should not leave everything open. I think what makes me struggle is this mixed up situation of performance, presentation, workshop. When I think of making people do something, I like this in between. We have to find a strategy that pushes, almost like an act, that people become acts that show how things are functioning. Finding a strategy that is quite mechanical, but in a sense will be self-generating. The acting on itself. So we will make a diagram. Yes, and maybe we can have some coordinates or categories on the paper, in the way the paper will be spatially divided. Let's say it's like a map, where we place what people say, and then the next statement will be placed on the paper in relationship to both what has been said before and the coordinates. We can ask people to try to think of ways in which they think and to give examples of how they embody the crisis in language. Their responses is what will be written. It is material that even if it comes from personal experience, here it is written down. It is material from them. I wonder how it can be formalized so that it becomes a strong frame, that it is not like sitting around a table and making notes about how we are feeling, that instead it is more of a grid that you can feel, something that's determining the speaker or stressing you out. Maybe it will be an exercise in repression, in the sense that we will need to think about how to talk without individualizing ourselves. But then, how we will be able to talk to each other. People are expressing and explaining something, it becomes externalized, a diagram that is the map for the next conversation. Everything we say comes out of the diagram, a rather collective moment of interpreting, taking the arguments of others, and what does the map or grid change? The way people would talk? Because obviously this is not about optimizing our way of speaking. So do we try to work on the question? Before we do this, we said there would be some categories indicated on the paper. That is, the paper is not blank. I tried something in order to understand what the problems might be. I made a kind of grid. On top, I made a line with self, language, crisis, capitalism, and on the bottom, collectivity, unconscious body, embodied mechanisms, labor, career, and the notion of value. Could this be a possible grid, or would it be already too much? Maybe that's a good idea with the categories and to see how it works. Your concern is that some of the relations might disappear? I'm not sure. My experience with diagrams is a rather paradoxical one. Visually, you are building up something that makes sense, and on the other hand, it constantly fails to make sense, getting absurd. If there's no grid or categories, I imagine it would become very confusing. But when you have this grid, it is predetermining. What we want from the grid is to have a rigid system that people have to refer to. Something collapses or comes together, for example, the personal expression and the grid. But I don't know if it really works when we have so many terms, or if it is too obvious. Maybe we can choose 3 terms, or 4. Let's try to find terms from the field that you already have. Okay, maybe it is interesting to include one rather emotional term, something like desperation, or isolation, or something existential, and not just the usual ones, crisis, capitalism, labor. Self and collective would be good to have. Instinctively, I put self to the top and collective to the bottom. And desperation to the left? We can also use another term, insecurity. Yes, maybe this is more precise in this context because it doesn't only refer to an emotional state or how you present yourself, but also an economical situation, precariousness. Okay, I put that on the left. And on the right, I don't know, I'm thinking of why capitalism, even though it is in crisis, has an impact on everything, especially in relation to insecurity. What about value? Okay, let's go with that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. You have to bear with me because I've just come from another conference today where I was performing, so I'm quite exhausted. So I'm actually a performer. I'm doing a MFA at Goldsmiths now. I'm in my first year. I've just started. Having studied at art school, doing a degree. I graduated in 2000, came out of art school and basically rejected it. For about 15 years, I guess it's been. So, yeah, so this panel really speaks to me on that side, on that front. So now I'm back in the institution, and yeah, I'm thinking a lot about navigating and negotiating that. I kind of want to move away from this binary in and out, because I think, yeah, specifically for the area I'm looking at queer and trans artists and people of color, I find it's much more of a complex relationship. So I'm just going to show you some of my work just so you get an idea of who I am. I do a lot of work around, I guess my work is quite political. It's a lot about body, space, and gaze. And I do a lot of public interruptions. So this is what I was doing today. This is part of a video piece that I made around structures and spaces defining you, and then I guess using performance as a way to then turn that on its, flip that over and actually have space to define and control the spaces that are usually defining me. So I basically prepared a presentation because I knew I'd be exhausted, so I'm sorry if it's just like very red. So, okay, so apart from being objectified or having one's artwork discussed in essentialized, racialized, exoticized, or heterosexist ways, queer artists of color often get ignored by art history and thus remain invisibilized. Yeah, we can go back.
You keep talking. I'm going to open them all up, yeah.
Cool. Due to prevailing structures within the art complex that privileges white, gender-conforming, male, Western European artists, and due to a number of excluding mechanisms such as the de-thematization of racism or the inherent Eurocentricism of art that causes a lack of knowledge or references to non-European, non-US American art and non-white histories within Europe, US, history or art and culture. Therefore, queer artists of color working with a set of references to art traditions other than Western European, US American ones will not be understood by white art historians or art critics trained in what claims to be universal art history. So I'm thinking a lot about, this survey that was conducted recently by Goldsmiths and Create. I don't know if people are aware of this. Has anyone in the audience heard about this? This survey, it's called Panic, What Happened to Social Mobility in the Arts. And it basically goes on to say that, yeah, it's basically a study that quite simply, I mean, it's the obvious that it's dominated by middle-class white people and a lot of people excluded. That's pretty much the synopsis. And they created a festival, a 10-day festival that was recently, I didn't manage to go down. I don't know if anyone here managed to go down and check it out, to try and counteract it, I guess, to counteract that failure or that exclusion. So arts and culture was being systematically removed from the state education system, and that art audiences were predominantly white middle class. Both factors were contributing to the creative sector becoming a closed shop, particularly to those from Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities, often called BAME, and less affluent backgrounds. White people working in the arts were less likely to acknowledge the barriers facing BAME people trying to get a foothold in the sector, while 44% of those from BAME backgrounds felt ethnicity was either essential or very important to getting ahead in the arts. And only 12% of white participants saw it as an issue. I'm not sure how exactly they conducted the research. I think it was an open call out for people to contribute. So that's the format of that survey. So that was a festival. So basically I was involved in a conference early last year, this year, it's been a long year, in January, in Oldenburg in Germany. And it was a conference called Perverse Assemblages. So one of the questions of the conference inquired into was how artistic and cultural works enable and even discourage critical reflection on the ways that media structures and reality, and to look at the intermediate effects and the potential behind works that criticize and rework heteronormative, racist, and capitalist orders, in particularly with respect to questions of temporality, affect, art, aesthetics, and collectivity. So I was part of a panel called Queering and Decolonizing Art with Sandrine Mikos-Aikins and Rena Onat, who is a student there. The panel provided a glimpse of what is possible and what kinds of topics could be explored if there were opportunities for queer artists, academics, and activists of color to have these kind of debates and have funding for art production and research. So that's kind of one of the issues, is not having the resources to have these conversations institutionally. Because there are hardly any spaces, neither within art institutions or within academic institutions, that provide a platform for artwork and research from queer, black, people of color perspectives as self-representations, but also in critical thinking and doing. So this kind of work obviously is being done, but it's being done in activist community spaces, which is outside of the institution. So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about knowledge production and what is considered value. And we were talking earlier, Carolyn, about having, when these discussions get a platform, we were talking in relation to the Turner Prize and Assemble. So, yeah, I'll give you some more images. Sorry, I can't do both things at once. So that's us, that's Rena Onat in the middle, and Sandrine Mikos-Aikins, who's a curator on the right there. So where am I? So this work is being done in activist and community spaces, which allows us a certain independence from hegemonal forms of representation, but also very precarious and marginalized spaces to be in. So this leads me to talking about the work, how basically the spaces that are created outside of institutions to have these conversations. So I'm thinking specifically around kitchen table conversations and like round table conversations. And so there's a, sorry, this is in the wrong order actually. This is a book actually that Sandrine wrote and edited with Sharon Dodu-Atu, which is called The Little Book of Big Visions, which I'll just mention. So it's How to Be an Artist and Revolutionize the World. If people haven't seen it, you should definitely get a copy of this. Very interesting. It's mostly in the German context, but it's transferable knowledge. So back to the kitchen table conversation. Oh, it's very tiny. It's actually the same size as the book. So Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, Regenerating Violent Times and Places by Jin Haratuan is an amazing read. I haven't read it all, but it's Christmas holidays now, so you can get a chance to read that. So yeah, in terms of thinking about kitchen table conversations as a space for regeneration, strategization, a space for ranting because we need them, and for healing. So using personal experiences, I know the other Carolyn mentioned that, as a vantage point, for example, kitchen table conversation, collective creativity, round table conversations. It seems relevant to mention now that I'm part of a arts collective, where is it? Collective Creativity, and we are a collective of queer and trans intersex people of color who basically came together in, we talked about desperation and desperate need to just have a space to critically grow, where we were not feeling, either we were in institutions or outside of institutions and feeling that we didn't have that criticality to be able to nourish our practice and grow. So we created this space, and we've been running for about 2 years now. It's an open collective, it's very informal, we have sessions, round tables. We did something at Nottingham Contemporary around the politics of the art school, and creating it. We're actually right now in process with Jana Graham creating a a publication of how to survive the art school for students, for local students. So, and that's something we want to build on. We also work a lot on archiving and documentation, and we've talked about this already, like how do we do this work of archiving, documenting our movements and not reinventing the wheel, but then how do we actually practically do that when we don't feel like we necessarily want to be archived in a box and shoved in an institution. So anyway, so I'm just digressing a little bit, but it links in to what I'm talking about. So a lot of the questions that are being posed already are things that, you know, we're also thinking about. 2 minutes, oh no, okay, I'll have to go through. Okay, so we get the point. So this work is happening outside of institutions. Another point to make is around being the whole kind of internationalism of the art world and how that's really problematic in terms of local artists who fall outside of that. We're not international enough, blah, blah, blah. We already know this. And then the other thing was about instrumentalization. So in the introduction to the book Queer Lovers and Hateful Others, which I've already shown you, Jin Haratawan talks about this, about, okay, I'm going to read the quote. "This experience taught me that intellectuals who cross organic professional lines are especially vulnerable to backlash. In the meantime, our work was being plagiarized. We too became pre-theoretical raw material to which real academics were able to help themselves, while depoliticizing our messages and resourcing our labor for a sexy and new, respectable debate, whose cutting edge depended on culling the irrational and excessive margin. It is not a coincidence that repression occurs when our knowledges leave the kitchen table," as queer knowledges. So yeah, what happens when we are navigating the institutions and our knowledge is instrumentalized? Yeah, there's loads of interesting things to say. Should have been faster. Some more pictures. Yeah, so, I mean, what I'll leave... yeah, some questions, because I think questions are important rather than trying to figure out solutions. I don't know. How can we achieve a more sustainable outlet for queer, black, of colour knowledges and creative work? Is it possible to break up exclusive structures within existing institutions? Is it desirable to create our own infrastructure institutions? What are the traps of institutionalization? I mean, the main reason why I'm at Goldsmiths right now is just to get resources, to be honest. So I think that's one of the main things, is not having the resources to even... Or that's being one of the main reasons why we enter institutions, is for resources. So is there another way of, redistributing those resources? And then lastly, I'm going to just mention an Audre Lorde quote, which is, "Survival is not an academic skill. It's learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, how to make common cause with those others identify as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. It is learning how to make our differences and make them strength." And then the next quote is one that's quoted quite a lot from Audre Lorde, and it's something that I'm still grappling with and thinking about. "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I'll end there. But yeah, I would like to kind of discuss that.
Thank you for that. I've forgotten his name. Raju. Thank you for that. Because what you did was introduce the notion of... Yeah, you! Who else? You introduced the notion of structure, and I've been thinking quite a lot about structure, because what I want to talk to you about is a piece of experience that happened to me and to other people, which I thought at the beginning it was about me having a career in theatre. And it turned out to be something not quite that, though it had that in it as well. When it all started out... well, I'll say firstly, I'll go through the 4 issues in case I don't get to the end of them. The structure of my exit from the mainstream theatre is a theme of this. My own actual trajectory as a result of that is another theme. And when that particular phase of the trajectory ended, as they began to remove a lot of theatre from funding, there's that. And then there is my most surprising moment, which is that I am also working for the Serpentine with Amal Khalaf in a way that I would never, 30 years ago, have begun to imagine that I would, or would think that I would be speaking here or the Liverpool Biennial that I spoke out of a while ago. It couldn't have occurred to me before, or even 3 years ago it probably couldn't have occurred to me. So, okay, I'm going to talk about a theatre structure that we developed in order to protect ourselves from loneliness and divorce from everything that we needed. There was a very powerful theatre movement from the late 60s and right through the 70s, and it fought for funding and it got funding, and I was one of the people who led that. A lot of it was political, some of it wasn't political in its own name, but the nature of the movement was highly political because it challenged the structure of theatre. It challenged the notion of national theatres, of major theatres in towns as the peak of theatre practice. And it introduced the notion that theatre could be for wide numbers of people in all sorts of unrecognisable to the mainstream places. Ordinary people, working class people, who of course, as we all know, hate theatre and the arts, as we're told as we grow up. They hate it because they're ignorant and stupid. And so in the 70s, we fought for a movement of theatre to get funding so that a wide spread of work could be practiced. There were lots of disagreements amongst us, and we're talking about whether or not we're all the same. We were not all the same. We were very, very different. We had absolutely opposing views quite often, but we wanted to distribute our work to the country, and we got together for that. We were called the Association of Community Theatres, and we fought a massive battle. What actually happened to me was that I grew up wanting to work in the theatre. I was taken to Stratford as a child. I adored Shakespeare. I loved Laurence Olivier, who was dead a long time ago, folks, but don't worry about it. John Gielgud, all that lot, adored them. I saw them as a child. I watched them doing whatever it was they did. And I wanted to go into the theatre. So I went to university. I went to drama school and studied stage management because women couldn't easily become directors at that time, practically not at all. There was very little training for directors. So I go and do stage management on the basis that I can watch theatre directors working. I then get sacked twice. I go to the Royal Court Theatre and work for the extremely famous Bill Gaskell, a left-wing, highly progressive company. I am bullied in rehearsal. I'm protected by my first stage manager and not by the second, who's a creep. And so for not doing anything in particular except my job rather well, but by refusing to acknowledge the bullying, by being apparently scared, I am fired and told I'm insufficiently subordinate. Now that was what the production manager, you are insufficiently subordinate. This was a gay, left-wing theatre company full of what men who had been closet gays until 68, wasn't it? When it became legal. Now, they had about as much sense of what to do about women as toads. And they behaved like toads to me and to other women. They didn't like them. It was a sort of run over from a very bad time for gay people, really appalling, which was beginning to release by the end of the 60s. But also a theatre dominated by men who didn't think twice about it. So I think, oh goodness, I've been sacked. Oh, insufficiently subordinate, that sounds quite good. And I move on to the Royal Shakespeare. I move on to Charles Marivitz at the Open Space Theatre, who is an open-minded maniac who I should have stayed with. I then get a job at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and lo, I am sacked again. But this time I'm sacked for trying to start a strike, which I think was quite a good thing to do, because actually it's better to get sacked for something you actually try to do than just for sitting there. But I did get sacked, and I got a good reference when I left, because the strike was, well, it was their fault, and they kind of knew it, but they couldn't do anything. But anyway, so I get sacked again from the mainstream. But in the course of that, I see Terry Hands, John Barton, all the most famous male directors working. I work under them as an ASM. I watch them working. I don't like it very much. I don't like the way they push people around and dominate. And I think, I don't believe I will ever be a director. I get sacked, thank goodness. So I go off, I start a theatre company in the early 70s, 1972, with colleagues. It was called Recreation Ground, and we start to do an enormous amount of lunchtime theatre. We eventually become a political theatre company and start doing anti-fascist theatre. In the course of that time, there was a massive alternative theatre movement which brewed up from the late 60s onwards. Some very well-known companies were coming online, and we became part of that movement. Because I was a member of Equity, I decided, A, that everybody should join Equity because it was a union, and B, that we should get funding, because there was no real funding for that theatre, and it was distributing stuff to children, it was going to political, it was going to the trade union movement, it was going everywhere, doing all sorts of things, and quarrelling, of course, amongst itself totally, all the time, in a really entertaining way. There were big companies, and there were small companies. The big companies wanted to dominate. However, what we did out of Equity, and we set up, the Equity members set up an organisation called TACT, rather strangely, the Association of Community Theatres, and then out of that another organisation, Independent Theatre, got set up, and we fought for, very effectively, funding for the field of work as a whole. We were able to unite sufficiently to agree on that. In other ways, we quarrelled bitterly for years. Right, so this frightened the Arts Council in about 1972. A friend of mine did it and distributed it anonymously. She rang the Arts Council from a phone box in Victoria Station and said, had they read it? They said they had. They asked her who she was, she wouldn't tell them, and they invited her eventually to lunch to try to find out who she was. In the meantime, we were demonstrating outside the Arts. I've got photographs, there's a whole load. Stages in the Revolution has got the whole account of this. We were demonstrating about outside the Arts Council in Piccadilly. We caused the most terrible row and fuss. And we demanded £1 million for the Fringe, because that's what we were. I won't go into detail. We eventually got £500,000 for the Fringe, and we started applying for money, and it was broadly distributed across a lot of companies who went all over the country. They decided where they went. We were not funded by the National Theatre. We were funded as companies that were distributing their work all over the country. And it was a very powerful and very exciting movement, highly politicised. I did anti-fascist work. We were chased around the countryside by the National Front for a year or two. We literally were, and we got attacked in Bradford. Other people were doing similar kinds of things. Some people were in the park with the kids. It was all within that movement. I read at that time, I will read a quote, it's the only one I've got, Chairman Mao. Don't laugh too much. In the world today, all culture, all literature and all art belong to definite classes that are geared to definite political values. There is in fact no such thing as art for art's sake, art that stands above classes, art that is detached from or independent of politics. Proletarian literature and art are part of the whole proletarian revolutionary cause. They are, as Lenin said, the cogs and wheels of the whole revolutionary machine. Now, we can substitute some of that vocabulary, can't we? And think about feminist theatre. We can think about theatre that is for people and on behalf of and by people. And I've always thought that he was absolutely right. I then realised he was a bit of a criminal too. And so my time as a Maoist was rather sharply reduced. I was fired from the Maoist party by Cornelius Cardew. Yes, thank you, Cornelius. Again, quite a relief really, but I did learn an awful lot. I learned a lot about culture. I learned about the class nature. I learned about the partisan nature of culture. And that was a revelation to me. It had been troubling me for a long time. And it was Mao who at that point explained it. There are many other theorists who are far more complex and better than Mao. But at least that explained to me why going to Stratford was becoming more and more of a problem and why working there was hell on legs. It was partly at least a class issue, which doesn't mean we don't bully each other from positions of power. We of course do. But at least we can say something about it, we hope. So during our movement developed all sorts of ethical structures. The politics of we called ourselves the Fringe, and we had a set of ethics, and there are other sets as well, which I won't go into. And just see what the next one of those is. Yes, this is our fight against, oh my God. We had a set of ethics, politics of vocation, of choosing where we were in the structure, of thinking about who the audience is, particularly of who the audience is, politics of engaging the public in the public arena in the many different ways that you can do it, politics of getting paid, fighting for minimum wages and conditions. We wrote the contracts for equity. We had to fight to get into the union at all because it was a very elite union focused on the National Theatre, Laurence Olivier and all the people I'd worshipped during the 60s and I no longer worshipped. But they were the ones in charge and very, very right-wing, if not fascist. So we had to fight on all sides. We had to fight the Arts Council, we had to fight the union, and now there are very good contracts. We wrote the contracts. We also observed, as we began to get funding, we began to see that we were having money distributed to us. And the Arts Council, as a result of everything that we did, particularly the big demonstration we did on the night the Queen went to the National Theatre as it was opening, some very nice photographs of that, really nice. We had a huge dragon puppet, and it was actually a white elephant. And it was dancing with the kids outside the National Theatre. And as the Queen arrived with Peter Hall and got out of their car, it became perfectly plain that this puppet was a white elephant, and the whole audience saw it transform before their very eyes into a white elephant. It was great. Peter Hall was furious. We were called a bunch of grubby thrusters by J.W. Lambert, who was the Sunday Times critic. Right. We actually did really rather well. We got a whole field of work funded. By the end of that period, as Thatcher began to arrive, we began to see that the notion that we should be funded was beginning to fade. So although we were up for it, we were not going to get it anymore on that scale. Though there are plenty of companies in the portfolio now who were formed during that period. And so at that point, a lot of us changed direction. I went to Augusto Boal, who some of you may have heard of, Theatre of the Oppressed, and began to work. I think what I pull out of this is how do you do what you want to do within the frameworks that if you can create them, you do them. And when that goes wrong, what do you do next? So I went off and did the theatre I'm doing now, which is a political workshop theatre, which is again still about changing the world. And I think other people, some have done the same thing, others went back into the mainstream theatre structure. The Two National Theatres document was particularly annoying. That is a draft revised, that's a draft tacked constitution. I'll be about another minute or so. I think that the thing that I pull out of this is that I do believe really strongly that we should organise together. Then what I do or what you do or what we all do, we can share, we can quarrel, we can do anything we like. When I was at the biennial, I said, I thought, there should be a union. And people said, but we're all so different. We're not that different. We're different in what we want to do in our work. But we are not different in what we need. We need to eat. And we need some form of recognition, whether it's from whoever it's from our communities, whoever it is. And we need to be able to protect ourselves. And so out of this, working now with the Serpentine, with funding from an elite gallery, which is behaving in the most remarkably progressive way, is very, very good to work for and doesn't interfere, leaves you to do your work. I think other people who are working there find the same thing. We're having a very interesting moment that I'm working with the Serpentine. I'm here, we're all together, which we haven't been before. So I'm wondering how we can make that togetherness work better and work for us, where we begin to see that the differences are probably not the most important thing for us. Thank you.